beginning of the Feast of Purim, which in John chapter 5, Jesus goes to Jerusalem for a feast. It's not specified which one it is. It's got to be the Feast of Purim, because the next thing is Passover. And Purim comes a month before Passover, and we'll get to that later on. So that's basically the story. But now, who wrote it? Who wrote the book of Esther? And I'll go ahead and answer this right now. We really don't know. It has been suggested that Mordecai or Esther or Mordecai and Esther worked together to write the story. The problem is, why does Mordecai write but use the third person? He never speaks of himself as I. Well, that's an actual literary tool a lot of writers use. So that's really not a big problem. Others think, and you don't have to pronounce this guy's name, Joachim or Joachim, and I've reserved the right to misspell that. If you find it spelled differently, that's okay. It is spelled with a K and another I or two in there. He was a high priest, but he was a high priest. He would have been in Jerusalem, and that's going to be a problem as we go through. Others suggest Ezra or Nehemiah or the great synagogue. Now, we all know who that is, right? No, we don't. That's one of those mysterious things that developed over time in Palestine, and is kind of the ancestor of the Jewish Sanhedrin, or at least kind of indicates or aims towards that direction. But the final analysis, we really do not know the identity of the person who wrote the book of Esther. But we do know this. This person must have been a Jew. He must have, or she must have been a resident of Persia, probably in Susa, the palace. This person had accurate knowledge of the events that are recorded. I mean, there's some things in there that you got to talk to Mordecai to find out. You got to talk to Esther to find out, because there's a messenger between Mordecai and Esther as you read through the story, that you got to be in there close to know those things and to make a record of it. This person also was aware, very well aware, very in tune with the culture and the practices both of the Jews and of the Persians. And so all of that points to someone who lived right there in that vicinity. Now, when? The story of the book of Esther takes place between 485 and 465 BC. When we read our Bibles, we fail to pay attention to time frame. I asked a group one time, how long did it take for the 10 plagues to occur? And I was told anywhere from 10 days to 2 months. Actually, a little over a year, maybe longer, for those 10 plagues to occur. How long was Noah in the ark? Your first response is 40 days and 40 nights. No, that's how long it rained. Ask these elementary kids to help build the model of the ark. A year and a month. The time they were actually in the ark. But as we read through, we don't catch those times and dates. So as you read through Esther, I want to challenge you to look for the time frame, because it will specify this year of the king and this month. And you realize that this didn't all happen in just a few days. This happened over a period of years. But the book was written by the year 400, give or take a little bit. Now, I've got up here 485 to 465 BC. Everybody knows what BC stands for, right? You nod this away. Okay, it means about correct. Because any date we give before Christ is about correct. There's a lot of variances. So you read in this commentary, and that will give you 1 year. You read this commentary, it gives you a different year. Okay, go with that, it's all right. But don't put too much panic on that. The book was written for the Jews of Persia. And then for Jewish posterity. Now, we back up, and we won't do it, we back up to the map of Persian Empire, and there is a decree made that's sent out to everybody in the empire. How long did it take for that message to get out? Remember, they did not have internet. or CNN or any other of these great news medias. News traveled semi-fast compared to what we think of. There was and we'll talk about this later, there was a system that kind of antedated and was the, what's the right word, influence or, I've lost the word there, inspiration maybe for Benjamin Franklin to invent the Pony Express, or whoever invented it. They did have that kind of a system set up. But we get a message as a Jew that on this particular date, you can read the story, we'll find this. On this particular date, all the Jews are going to be killed. Then a few months later, we get another one that said the Jews can defend themselves. So we're down here in Ethiopia, or in India, or in Macedonia, and we get this message, why? We're not in Susa where all these events took place, and there was explanation, and it took a while for the rumor mill to get out there and explain, well, there's this things going on with Haman. So why did they need to know this? And on this date, everybody had this feast. Okay, for some of these people, it might have been the next year before they celebrated the feast. We miss out on that time framing as we go through. So the book of Esther was written for everybody in the Jewish population to understand what was going on for the Feast of Purim and what had actually happened to save their lives. But with any book of the Bible, there are peculiarities in the book. When we looked at the Gospels, we looked at Mark, and there are some things that Mark says that the others don't, and vice versa. Well, in the book of Esther, there is no mention of prayer. Now, hang on to your horses on this one because this gets fun as you go through. There's no mention in the book of Esther of Jerusalem, Palestine, or the temple. Now, you might accept that because it was written outside of Palestine, for Jews outside of Palestine. We could kind of live with that one. But there's no mention at all of any of the Jewish institutions. There's nothing said about the Passover, the Sabbath day, or Moses, or the law of Moses. There's no religious teaching. I mean, you take the book of Esther, you take it out of the Bible, hand it to a person who's never read the Bible, who doesn't know anything about God, and say, read this. They'll read it and say, that's a real good story. I like that. Now tell them it's in the Bible. Draw a religious lesson from the book of Esther. There's not one. But here's the worst one. God is not mentioned in the book. You can read from verse 1 to verse 3 of chapter 10, and you'll not find the name of God in any shape, form, or fashion, not even an inference towards God. He's not called El Shaddai, he's not called Elohim, the name Jehovah's not there. None of the names of God, none of the synonyms for God, nothing about God is said throughout the whole book. The closest we get is where Mordecai says to Esther, who knows, you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That's as close to get any indication that there's a religious overtone throughout the whole book. Because of this, a lot of people say Esther does not belong in the Bible. And when they were working together to develop what we call the canon, not the gun, the word canon means a measuring reed or a standard. When they were working to develop which books belong in the Old Testament, which books belong in the New Testament, there are a number of books that are argued about on both sides. And that's a whole nother level of study that most of us don't want to get into. And unless your faith is really strong, I suggest you don't think about it, because it will challenge what you believe about the Bible, honestly. And it will shake you up to believe or understand that there are people who think that Esther, because she doesn't mention God, doesn't belong in the Bible, and here is why. But yet, when they worked on the Old Testament canon, this is going to be by the time of Malachi, this great synagogue was working on developing which books belong in the Old Testament. Esther was not challenged. Everybody accepted it. They believed it had to be in there because it was the story of Jewish heritage. Now, there's some other questions about other places, and maybe even chapters and verses that do or do not belong in the Bible. But that's, like I said, a whole other level of study. The events of Esther fit historically with Ezra and Nehemiah. They are in the same time frame, as we'll see in a little bit. So between chapter 6 and 7, the book of Ezra, is where the events of Esther fit. So I want you this week to read the book of Ezra. And you read in the first 6 chapters, Ezra talks about the return from the captivity. I'll explain a little more about that in a minute. And then in chapter 7, it's Ezra in Jerusalem. And so in between chapter 6 and 7 is when the events of Esther take place. There's also a change in the kingship of Persia at that time. So that's the time frame for Esther. But now the question we'll look at today, why were the Jews in Persia in the first place? How did they get there? What were they there for? Most of us, when we read the Bible, think about Israel, we have them in the land of Canaan, land of Palestine. I mean, they're brought there by Joshua. Moses led them out of Egypt. Joshua put them in. They settled out. Then the kingdom was divided. And for some reason, we just kind of leave them there. Because when we pick up the New Testament, they're there. And we don't think about them ever moving out of town for a while. But no, they did. And as we'll see. So why were they in Persia in the first place? When we read our Bibles, or any other book for that matter, we don't pay attention to what's going on outside of the story. Think about that. You read Tom Sawyer. Mark Twain lived on the Mississippi River. Tom Sawyer sat on the Mississippi River. And you read that, and there's nothing said in there about anything going on in New York, or in Florida, or California, or Canada. It's not that these places didn't exist and things weren't happening. They're just not part of our story and focus. So when we read the Bible, we don't think about what's going on in the world outside of the Scripture. Back in June of last year, kind of odd to say that now, isn't it? In June of last year, the children's ministers and their spouses went up to Kentucky to the Ark Encounter. I highly recommend you if you have time to do that. It's wonderful. But while we were there, we bought a historical chart. And it took some time. We got it mounted on the wall back there in the children's wing. If you have a chance to go back there and take some time to study that, it is remarkable to realize that while this is happening here, this is happening in the rest of the world. I mean, the whole world's going on at the same time. So what's going on? The world empires that affect our story, Assyria became to power around 744 and lasted until about 612. The Babylonians destroyed Assyria at the hands of Nabopolassar, who was the father of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Don't worry about these big names. You don't have to remember them. You don't have to pronounce them. There will not be a spelling test next week. Okay? So don't panic about that. It's something I've learned a long time ago, and it's just kind of stuck. I apologize for that. But anyway, Assyria was a major world empire, kind of one of the first in that general area. And they were destroyed by Babylon, and in 536, they were destroyed by Persia. And in Persia in 333 was destroyed by Alexander the Great in Greece and so forth. Okay? So now turn your Bibles to 2 Kings 15. And I've got verse 27 there. I'm going to back up to verse 19. 2 Kings 15 and verse 19. Pul, also known as Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, came against the land, that is, the land of Israel. And Menahem, who was the king of Israel at the time, gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver so that his hand might be with him to strengthen his kingdom under his rule. This is about 740 or so BC. And it is thought that at that time, Pul took a number of captives with him back to Assyria. Now down to verse 27. In the 52nd year of Azariah, the king of Judah, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, became king over Israel and Samaria and reigned for 22 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, with which he made Israel to sin. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, very important, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured Ijon, Abel, Beth-Maacah, Genoa, Kedesh, Hazor, and Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Assyria. Now, what's not here is that several years before this, another story took place. Jonah was told by God to go to Nineveh and cry against that great city. Before Jonah, when Assyria conquered the people, they were treated very brutally. Okay? There are records that indicate that the king had the kings and princes and princesses and queens and children and so forth that he conquered flayed alive. That means they cut their skin off while they're still alive. They treated, and that's, I'm not going to get to the worst stuff, as if that's not bad enough. After Jonah, Assyria changed their policies. And instead of being so brutal to people they conquered, they practiced a system of deportation and importation. They carried the people away and put them in other areas of the empire in small groups. In their place, they took people from those areas and put them there. And so we would take this section over here and depart them, put them way over there, close to India. This section we put over in Macedonia. This section in Ethiopia, and so on. And we'd take some of their people and put them back in here. And so we've got different ethnic groups. We'd have different tongues or languages. We'd have different cultures and practices. And we're not going to get together because we can't communicate. And so this fellow over here sees this pretty girl over here, and this fellow over here would like to marry this pretty girl over here, but their families are so different in culture and language, he can't do it. And these guys over here think that, you know what, if we got ourselves together, we could rebel against this king, but we can't communicate. So therefore, we can't coordinate. That causes issues. So it's a pretty good idea. Now keep reading. So he took, now I realize you may not know all these cities and places, but he took the land of Galilee. You know who that is. The land of Naphtali. The upper portion of Israel. He deported all of these people and carried them away. This is about 734 BC. Now, you keep reading. This is the first carrying away by Tiglath-Pileser, okay, of Assyria. I needed to advance. There we go. Now, chapter 17 and verse 6. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and this king was Shalmaneser, and carried Israel away into exile to Assyria, and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Haven't mentioned them yet. The Medes are the same as the Persians. That's how the Jews got to Persia, by Assyria deporting them and transplanting them elsewhere. Now you can say, wait a minute. They're called Jews. The Jews were from Judah. That's right. The Israelites, the northern kingdom of Israel, was carried away by Assyria. But just hang with me. This is about Shalmaneser, and this is in 721 BC. Now, this is the Shalmaneser who, after he conquered Samaria, went down to Lachish, which is Philistine territory, and sent an embassage to Jerusalem requiring their surrender. And Hezekiah, at the advice and guidance of Isaiah, said, we ain't going to do it. And they began to lay siege to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah prayed, and Isaiah said, don't worry about them. They ain't coming in the city. They ain't going to shoot an arrow up this way. And the next morning, after the angel of God passed through, 185,000 Assyrians woke up dead. Now, that's what it says. You go back and read. It's in 2 Kings and then Isaiah, but go ahead and find that. That's what it says. They woke up dead. And so they retreated. Shalmaneser went home in defeat to Syria, was killed by a couple of henchmen, and was replaced by Sargon II. But that's a whole other story. Okay. So, but they were settled in the cities of the Medes. So here's how they got that far. Now, still in 2 Kings, go over a few chapters to chapter 24 and verse 1. Israel is destroyed. They're out of the picture. Judah remains alone for about another 150 years or so. But in the days of Jehoiakim, he's the king at this point, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. This is in 606 BC. Nebuchadnezzar comes against, of course, by this time, back up to 612 BC, Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed Assyria. And then Nebuchadnezzar, his son, takes over as king. He comes to Jerusalem, exacts a tribute, and carries captives away. Notable captives are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were carried. Now keep this date in mind. We'll come back to this later on. All right, still reading chapter 24, verse 10. At that time, Jehoiakim was the king. The servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, went to Jerusalem. The city came under siege, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while the servants were besieging it. This is in 597 BC. And here Nebuchadnezzar takes away a bunch of folks, including Ezekiel, and plants them on the river Kibar, which is in that neck of the country. Then in chapter 25, Nebuchadnezzar returns. I won't read the whole chapter. But this time they destroy the city. The temple is burnt. Whatever's left of its furnishings and its riches are carried to Babylon. The walls are destroyed, knocked down, and Jerusalem is ruined. And if you read chapter 25 carefully and flip over to the parallel passage in 2 Chronicles, there's a reason for all of this. Because of their idolatry, both of Israel and of Judah, God had them transported out. He had them taken away from the land. And the land would have its 70 years of Sabbaths or rest. There's a point with God that he gets to, he says, enough. That happened with Noah. God said, Noah, I've had it with men. 120 years, build an ark. God had enough. He went to Abraham and said, I'm going to go down to Sodom and see if it's as bad as I think it is. If it is, I'm going to destroy it. It was, and he did. But God had enough of their sinfulness. And God had had enough of Israel and Judah and the idolatry to finally, he said, enough's enough. And he condemned them to this exile. Destroyed the temple. But there is a reasoning behind all of this we'll see later on. When Paul started his missionary journeys, where did he go first? He went, when he got to town, to a synagogue. That was a result of this exile period. While Israel was out of the country, couldn't go to the temple, couldn't worship, they set up the synagogue system. So this happened in 586 BC. Oh, skip the slide there. In 586 BC, and Jeremiah was the prophet, was left in Jerusalem. A governor, Gedaliah, was set up in place to kind of control the country, and it was not a good situation. And actually, Jeremiah, he had plans to go to Babylon, but his friends basically kidnapped him and carried him down to Egypt, and we think he died down there. So, 2 Chronicles now, what's a long ways away? 2 Chronicles chapter 36. The last two verses of the chronicler. In the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, in 536, give or take a few years, Cyrus destroyed the Babylonians. I think 539, they destroyed the city of Babylon. And One night Cyrus couldn't sleep. By the way, his cohort was Darius the Mede. So this is the Persians and the Medes working together. One night Cyrus had trouble sleeping, and so he had someone read to him the literature of the peoples that he'd conquered. They read to him from the book of Isaiah, conquered from the Jews. Little known fact, in Isaiah, written 800 years before Christ, so 300 years before Cyrus. Cyrus not even thought of. Isaiah said that the servant of Jehovah, Cyrus, calls him by name, is going to allow the people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild. That shook him up. So Cyrus made the decree, back to verse 22 of chapter 36 of 2 Chronicles, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah and Isaiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom and put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord God, his God be with him, and let him go up. If you wanted to go back home to Jerusalem and participate in rebuilding the temple and its walls, go. Now, what's not said here, it's said in Ezra. If you wanted to go, you're free to go. However, the people of the city where you dwell are going to take up a collection and send with you for the temple. They'll also give you the traveling money that you would need to get to Jerusalem, wherever you lived in the whole Persian Empire. Go. Zerubbabel, of the descendants of David. You read about him in Matthew chapter 1. He led a large group, some 7,000 plus back to Jerusalem to begin the work of rebuilding. Okay, well, pause there for just a minute. The Persian kings. Cyrus reigned from 539 to 530. Cambyses, 530 to 522. Darius the second, 522 to 486. Keep him in mind. Xerxes, 486 to 464. Keep him in mind. And Artaxerxes Longimanus. Let him put that name up there. I couldn't spell it. 464 to 423. Now, these are important. All right, I'll go back through these again. Cyrus, Ezra chapters 1, 2, and 3, commanded the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. Cambyses, during his reign, the building was stopped because the pressure of Tattenai, the governor of Samaria, who was a descendant of the mongrel group that was moved in there by the Assyrians. That's where the Samaritans came from. They wanted to help rebuild the temple, but the Jews, pure-blooded, in their, we don't call it prejudice, would not allow them to help rebuilding. And so there was a big argument. And actually the building of the temple was stopped for a while. This all happened during the reign of Cambyses. And in John chapter 4, the woman told Jesus, our fathers say in this mountain we're to worship. And on Mount Gerizim there was a temple to God. They had the first 5 books of the Bible. Your fathers say in Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah there was a temple where they worshiped God. She was coming out of this Samaritan group that was a result of that Assyrian policy of bringing folks in and carrying folks out. Of course, Jesus' answer was, worship God in spirit and in truth, not in Jerusalem, not in Samaria, but worship God in the heart. Okay. Darius, 536, during his reign, the temple was completed with the help of Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai, who saw the first temple. 70 years had passed during its destruction and rebuilding, and Haggai had seen it. He was an old man. Ezra chapters 5 through 6. Also, this is the Darius who put Daniel in the lion's den. Now, our Sunday school pictures show Daniel as a teenager, right? When I was in elementary school, Daniel was a teenager. When I was a teenager, Daniel was a little bit older. Daniel, if you remember, was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar in 606 BC. He was an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar and to the kings that followed him. Nabonidus, even Rodak Baladan, a couple others I don't want to try to pronounce right now, and Belshazzar, and Cyrus, and Cambyses, and Darius in Persia. Darius became king in 536. Now, my math ain't that good. That's 70 years. Daniel was probably 90 to 100 years old when they put him in the lion's den. And the lions did not eat him. He's too old and tough. Send somebody fresh down here. We don't want this old guy. So that kind of draws that in. Okay. Xerxes. He is the king of the book of Esther. He is Ahasuerus. And you say, well, how did they get Xerxes from Ahasuerus? Well, it's an interesting story. The Persian name is Ahasuerus, but I can't spell it in Persian, thankfully. I don't know any Persian. But Xerxes is the name given by others. The Greeks called him Xerxes. Herodotus, who is a historian at this time, calls him Xerxes. So I want to encourage you to do some reading about Xerxes. And then this is the king of Esther. After Xerxes, his son Artaxerxes Longimanus, called that because his hands were, by record, extremely long, some indicate that he hung down all the way to his knees. Now that's some pretty long fingers. I guess if he played the piano, he could really reach out and play it all. All right, but this is the king who told Ezra to go back and reestablish the law, who allowed Nehemiah to go back and rebuild the walls. He was the son of Xerxes. So I wonder, did Esther and her influence in the court of Persia have a preliminary influence on Artaxerxes to influence Ezra and Nehemiah to go back and reestablish the keeping of the law and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem? So, here's your map of the Persian Empire again. The Israelites, the Jews, by this time they were all called Jews. They lived all over the empire. They established synagogues all over the empire. They were preparing the way for the spread of the gospel all over the empire. So, in spite of Israel and Judah's wickedness, God used that to prepare the world for the birth of Jesus. So Paul says in Galatians, when the fullness of time had come, in other words, when God had the world ready, He sent forth His Son. But God had a lot of things to do together. And all this is going along in the background, and mankind in general is not paying attention to what God's doing. But God was at work throughout the whole thing. We'll come back to this map and so forth. Your assignment for this week, read the book of Esther 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. And read the book of Ezra and see how those things dovetail together. Also, lest I forget it and I get in serious trouble, this is the first Sunday of the month. Also the first Sunday of the year. Happy New Year. This is the day we need to take up our collection for the City of Children, for Angel and Mia. I have to stop and be sure I get the name right. So if you put that into your contribution envelope, add that to however you do that, we appreciate that very much. We're doing well with that. I guess before long we'll have pictures of Christmas if they send them to us and that kind of stuff. So we appreciate Judy handling the taking care of buying their presents for birthdays and Christmas and Easter and whatever else she does. She handles that and then tells me. So I appreciate her doing that. Thank you. God bless you. Hope you have a great and wonderful week. We're dismissed.